I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
All right, so we covered the first 5 verses. We're going to start reading at verse 3 in a minute of Revelation 11. But we've covered the first 5 verses, in which we are in, remember, we're in the interlude between the sounding of the 6th and the 7th trumpet. And we had chapter 10 dealing with some of that interlude where John was told to eat the book, and it would be sweet in his mouth and bitter in his stomach. Last week we covered the where John was told to measure, to take a measuring rod like a staff and to measure the temple and the altar and those who worship there, but do not measure the court outside. And we discussed how the temple is the sanctuary of God, the altar and those who worship in there. But he was very likely not to measure the court, because that's where the Gentiles were. The ones who didn't obey Christ. Remember, those who are in the temple are worshipers of Christ. They are the church. And we discussed verses in the New Testament that describe the church as the temple or sanctuary of God. Then we discussed how the Gentiles would bring grief on the holy city for 42 months. 42 is 3.5 years. 42 months, 3.5 years. 3.5 being half of 7, so not complete. And then we discussed what possibilities were for the holy city. The holy city being, well, it could be the city of Jerusalem, because that's described in the Old Testament as the holy city, or it could be the church, which would be a holy city, New Jerusalem, spiritual Jerusalem. And we had said it's based on what the book is talking about, persecution, and it would last for 42 months. That is therefore likely that it's talking about the church here, the spiritual church, and not Jerusalem, because if it was talking about Jerusalem, that would put this book farther back than we believe it to be written, before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And remember that the recipients here are 7 Gentile churches. And so if we're talking about when people come along try to say, well, this is all talking about Jerusalem, my point, and many other preachers' point, is why would 7 churches in Turkey be all too concerned with what is happening in Jerusalem if Jerusalem is not the central capital of Christianity? Now the Jews in those churches, yeah, they might be concerned, but overall, on a Gentile message, the Gentiles aren't going to really sit up and say, well, why are we worried about Jerusalem? We don't live there. We're not commanded to go there. It's not the physical place where we need to worship. Why are we concerned about Jerusalem? This book's not written about Jerusalem. It's written to churches who are facing persecution themselves. And so that's why we had come along and said, well, the holy city is therefore most likely the church. The church was only going to suffer persecution for an imperfect time. It would not destroy the church. The church would survive. It fits that imagery. But beyond that, we weren't really discussing too much more on that. Let's reread chapter 11, verses 3 to 13. We read one slide each. We'll start with Jeff and go to Gloria. And we'll read 3 to 13. We've already discussed the first couple questions, but let's just reread for our memory what's being talked about here.
And I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth.
And if anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. If anyone if anyone would harm them, this is how he is doomed to be killed.
Keep going.
They have the power to shut the sky, that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. And they have power over the waters to turn them into blood, and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they desire.
Henry, you want to get?
When they have finished their testimony, the beast that arises from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that symbolically is called Saturn and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified.
We'll come up to Tim when we skip you. You want to read 9 and 10, and then we'll go back to Jonathan?
For 3.5 days, some from the people and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their dead body and refuse to let them be placed in the tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and make merry and exchange presents, because these two prophets have been a torment to those who dwell on the earth.
After the 3.5 days, breath of life from God entered them, and they stood up on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies watched them.
And at that hour there was a great earthquake, and a tenth of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven.
All right. So let's go back. We got our we have our 2 questions, or actually we have the 1 question we covered last week, which was how long did the witnesses prophesy? How long? 1260 days. Now that doesn't sound that number doesn't sound that significant to us. Assume that there are 30 days in a month. How many months? This is 42 months, which is 3.5 years. There, we find these numbers coming up time and time and time again. 3.5, 7, 10, 12. We see these numbers all the time come up, and they have symbolic meaning. What does that mean? If the 2 witnesses are going to prophesy for 3.5 years, what does that mean symbolically?
Not a complete time.
It's not a complete time. There was going to come a time when they prophesied and they were going to die. We of course read that they are going to die. And people have made the point, well, who are these witnesses? And there are many. I heard them on the radio again trying to describe who these witnesses were. And the fact is, we just don't know. But remember, we discussed last week why there are likely 2. Remember, I asked you, does anyone remember what the bulletin article was titled last week? In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. Remember, witnesses, in order to have any significance under the law, you had to have 2 of them. Otherwise, if it was just 1 witness, and it was one person was accusing another person, you don't know what the truth is. But you have 2 witnesses, you know what the truth is. You can convict someone on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And we discussed in the Old Testament, there was Elijah and Elisha. They were together. We had the apostles and prophets often paired in language. The Holy Spirit and the apostles, the Old and New Testaments, pairs of things. Well, we have these 2 witnesses. And the olive trees supplied oil for their lamps. The lampstands hold forth and help distribute the light. And it's therefore God's 2 witnesses would stand and hold forth the word, which is the light, to the wicked world. Now in verse 5, what does God do for them? In verse 5 of chapter 10. Sorry, verse 5 of chapter 11.
He prevents anyone from harming them as fire proceeds out of their mouth and devours their enemies.
So during that time when they were prophesying, during that time God prevents them from being harmed. So in other words, God was allowing His word to go out. He wasn't going to allow His word to be stopped from going out. So He prevents them. And that brings us to our next question is what three things did the witnesses have power to do?
To be able to confirm the word with power.
Okay. I was looking for the physical things in verse 6 though. What they had power to do.
They could stop the rain.
Stop the rain.
Water to blood.
Turn water to blood.
Smite the earth with plagues.
Smite the earth with plagues. Now, of course, we remember this is symbolic, but this should remind us of something. What Old Testament story should this remind us of? Well, there's two of them.
Moses or Elijah.
Moses and Elijah. Moses, remember, he struck the earth with plagues, and God's used plagues throughout the Old Testament on different times and places. But Moses in Egypt, of course, water turned to blood. That was one of the plagues over Egypt. So people, that was a call for judgment. That was a judgment on Pharaoh. Same with the rain that didn't come from heaven. Elijah prayed and it didn't rain. Was it 2 or 3 years that it didn't rain? Because Elijah prayed in faith, and that was God judging the people of Israel under Ahab. And again, these witnesses are proclaiming the word of God, and they are professing that judgment is coming. God is judging His people. He is calling you to repent. And they had that power. But this again they aren't talking about physical turning water into blood. In the Old Testament, was water literally turned into blood? Yes. Did it literally not rain when Elijah prayed not to rain? Yes. But those Old Testament allusions are now brought to Revelation, and symbolically, it's to show that these witnesses have the power of God. The water wasn't turned to blood by Moses by anything with Moses' power. It didn't rain in Israel because of how special Elijah was. It was showing God's power. Faith of Elijah, faith of Moses, God's power. And so these two witnesses, these two faithful witnesses, had the power, or they had God behind them. In that sense, they were being their testimony was true. Any comments up to this point? Things I may have forgotten since I'm partly tired this morning.
James 5:17 said it didn't rain for 3.5 years.
3.5 years, very good. So I was trying to figure out whether it was 2 or 3, or it's even more than 3. Long time. Long time, 3.5 years. I find that 3.5. That's an interesting time. Even though that's literal there, I find that's interesting. 3.5. But 42 months. That's a long time to go without rain. California is right now going through some terrible wildfires because it doesn't. It's rained there, but not that much. California, Los Angeles is on fire, very literally on fire. You can see if you go on Google, and you can look at satellite pictures that they've taken from the International Space Station of just how big that fire is, because you can see the smoke billowing from space, and that lack of rain, drier. That's how famines start. That's in the Old Testament, and even here is described as judgment from God. Judgment was coming. Anything else? Well, then let's move on to on my back, which was question 7, is who would make war against and kill these witnesses?
Now we meet the beast.
Now we meet the beast. Oh, you took the words right out of my mouth, Bill. That was great. We meet the beast. We have not met the beast before in Revelation. We have sort of said, we have alluded to him many times. The beast is coming. The beast is coming. And so but we haven't met him yet. We'll discuss who the beast is later. We haven't identified him yet here in this chapter. He will be identified. We're going to know who he is. But all we have to know is where did he come from?
Out of the bottomless pit.
Out of the bottomless pit. We have seen the bottomless pit already. And remember, it was the locusts and the king of the locusts, and that came out of the bottomless pit. And we had discussed that it's most likely not the devil. That one, the dragon, is the devil in this book. And the beast is going to be somebody else. But when did the beast make war and kill the witnesses? So,
It's interesting, it says at the beginning of 7, when they finished their testimony. That's interesting.
that was where I was going. Will you explain why it was interesting to you?
Well, it's just that whatever they were doing, God allowed them the time to do.
God did not allow His word or anything to happen before it was time to happen. Remember, He was protecting them, but remember, it's 3.5, so their protection would end. It wasn't complete. They weren't going to live forever. There was going to be a time when they would have to die. God's protection. I'll get to you in just a second. And so when that was done, when their testimony was done, whatever God had told them that they needed to testify, when that was done, then the beast came and killed Zach.
And we can see a similar thing that happened even in Jesus' life. Jesus had many times when the crowd wanted to kill him, and he would disappear away from their midst, or something would happen that he would not be there anymore, until the time when he was supposed to die happened. Then he was able to be caught.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And I was going to make the point, but I thought you were too. God didn't send Jesus until the time was right. He didn't send Jesus in the time of Isaac, or in the time of Elijah, or in the time of David, or Ezra, or Malachi. He sent Jesus when the time was right. Everything was in place. You had the world was ready. The actors that were going to be needed, as far as you needed the Jews back in Judea, you needed the temple built, but you also needed certain sects of people who were going to be Jesus' adversaries. If everyone came and accepted Jesus, he wasn't going to die. He didn't come in a time of war where his life was in danger of being killed in war. He came in a relative time of peace. The Roman Empire had been around, had settled down, and relatively speaking, it's a time of peace, Zach.
And to show how small a time period this was of peace, 70 AD was not 40 years later after that, and 40 years before that was the time when Caesar and Mark Antony were fighting each other, and there would be armies walking through this land. This was the small gap of time when it was peace.
Yeah, it's very, very small, small time. But God, the time was absolutely right, and God had orchestrated all of that. He was going to send His Son when He was ready. It wasn't on man's timetable, it was on His. And so, when they had finished their testimony, the beast from the bottomless pit wars against them and kills them. Which gets us to question 8. what is the great city called symbolically, or depending on your version, spiritually? What was the name?
Sodom.
And
Egypt.
Sodom and Egypt. Oh, that wasn't mine. And so their dead bodies lie in the street of the great city. People knew that they were dead. They lied in the street. Spiritually, Sodom and Egypt. And it says something else at the end of that verse, verse 8.
Where the Lord was crucified.
Where the Lord was crucified. And because of that, some would see this as literally Jerusalem. Because they say, well, the Lord was crucified literally in Jerusalem. I'm not going to argue with that. But others see this as the whole wicked earth, as a waste city of evil and sin. And let's get some verses that go along with that, though. Let's see sort of how Revelation deals with cities like what's being described. We're to Annette. Revelation 14, verse 8.
Another angel, a second, followed, saying, Fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sensual immorality.
Again, when we get to Revelation 14, people are going to come along and try to make Babylon Jerusalem. I don't believe Babylon's Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not usually described that way. Jerusalem is usually described as a holy city, if it's going to be described anyway. Whether or not it's living that way, that's how it's usually described. Babylon was the capital of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, and Babylon was known as an evil city. And so, Revelation 14, verse 8, we'll come up to Gord, Revelation 18, verse 2.
And he called out with a mighty voice, Fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast.
Again, we have Babylon here is described as this detestable city. Sodom and Egypt, of course, the verse tells us, symbolically or spiritually. So in other words, we take this symbolically. If you come along and you say, well, but Christ was literally crucified in Jerusalem. Yes. But if you take this to mean the figurative language that I think it's supposed to mean, Sodom is remembered for what? It's evil. It's destroyed for its evil. Egypt, usually remembered for what?
For its evil.
For its evil. And so, where the Lord was crucified, it doesn't say the city where the Lord was crucified. It says where the Lord was crucified. How would you describe this earth when Christ was crucified?
It says, like, for Christians, every time we sin, we crucify Christ.
Mm-hmm. So, you would describe this earth as a sinful place then, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Without Christ's sacrifice, there was no righteousness available because there was no sacrifice for sin. Doesn't mean there weren't faithful people. I'm saying as far as without Christ dying, we have no hope. And so when we take this symbolically, this isn't literally talking, I don't think, about Jerusalem. But it's talking about the wicked world and evil. And Christ was crucified in that place. Plus, I will also make mention, Christ wasn't literally crucified in Jerusalem. He was crucified outside Jerusalem. Not in Jerusalem. And so, there is some, even though people would want to come along and say, well, this is literally Jerusalem, I don't believe it is. Because Jerusalem's never described the way Sodom is, the way Egypt is, the way Babylon is. I believe this is truly talking about sin. They lied in the streets, and all of the evil people were around looking at them. How long did they lie in the streets? Three and a half days. Now, literally speaking, how quickly did the Jews generally bury their dead?
Within 24 hours.
Within 24 hours. Literally speaking, this would be a disgrace to have a dead body lie in the street for 3.5 days. And of course, we know we're talking symbolically. It's the incomplete timing, and half of 7. That these prophets are not buried, but the wicked rejoiced in their death. Bury a dead body, and these prophets were probably poking their eyes into people of importance, just like John the Baptist did with Herod, Jesus did with the Pharisees, and they rejoiced. He died. There is contempt of the wicked for God's word. And then but what did God do after those 3.5 days?
They will not permit their dead bodies to be laid in the tomb.
Okay, but what happened then? In verse 11.
From God came unto them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell upon those who were watching.
So he did what?
They denied.
They raised him from the dead. In other words, God is going to triumph. The world thought, people thought here, the beast thought here, we've killed these witnesses, we win. No. God raised them up. God wins. God wins. This is not talking about Christ. Let's not apply this to Christ. Christ has already died. He has been raised up. This is a vision of victory. The beast thinks he's winning. The beast thinks all the time he's winning, he's winning, he's won. God wins. God triumphs. He raises these witnesses up. And when all this has happened, an earthquake struck, which is God's wrath, and destroyed 1/10 of the city and 7,000 people. 1/10, again, we have that fraction. Even though 10 is a complete number, it's 1/10, it's a fraction. 7,000. What's that a multiple of? 7 and 1,000. So we have 7, a complete number, 3 tens, which is 1,000, another complete number. Those who died, God completely killed. Like as far as they're like this is a complete number of who people are going to die. Remember, this is not a physical number. Talking 7,000 people are going to die. When God's wrath comes down, it will be complete. It will be complete among those who do not fear Him. And so, that's the vision. Any comments before we get verse 14? We're probably going to have time just for verse 14, and then we'll take up maybe with the rest of it next week. But, any comments?
You forgot verse 12.
What did I forget?
They went up to heaven.
Oh, okay, I did. He raised them up and took them up to heaven. That's a good point. I missed that. Sorry. It's in my notes. I just missed it on my page. He took them up to heaven. They triumphed. Now, that is the hope of a Christian. Be raised from the dead, to go to heaven. Remember what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15? Death is swallowed up in victory. God triumphs. Jeff.
It's interesting that comments that their enemies saw them.
Mm-hmm.
At least the New King James says that
Yeah.
they ascended to heaven in a cloud and their enemies saw them. Well, again, it would have to be spiritually, like spiritual significance here, because go to heaven, no one sees you.
Yeah.
Maybe someone I see you departing, that's
Yeah.
but in heaven they don't see you. So maybe the idea of the clouds, again, is this idea, as the Bible shows, a place of authority.
Yeah. Oh, good points, good ideas. But God is doing this in front of everybody. He's not doing this in secret. They killed them publicly, God raised them publicly. As far as in a symbolic sense. God is triumphing. Bill.
So just saying, all of this makes sense to us because even in the flood, God didn't destroy everything.
No.
Save 8. But all through the Old Testament, we see where he wiped out the nations that he wanted to wipe out.
Yeah.
And yet his goal, and then into the New Testament, no matter what happened, the church still kept going on. You know what I mean?
What we're going to get in our Wednesday night class is there are some people who believe that after the first century, especially with the rise of the Roman Catholic Church, that God's church ceased to exist on this earth for almost 1800 years. And I deny that. I just absolutely deny that. The book of Revelation denies that. Why is the Roman Catholic Church the most famous church on the planet? Like, as far as why do we have a lot of their history? Because they were the largest church. When Constantine organized the Roman Empire, what was left of it in 314, the Roman Catholic Church became the state religion. Well, the writers of history are written by those in power. And so, and because churches are autonomous from each other, they're not connected in hierarchy and popes and other things, we don't read about them in history. The Catholics were killing people who they called heretics. The church existed, so.
Well, and you might catch a glimpse throughout the Catholic history of people that you aren't for certain, but could possibly think of as maybe being the true Christians, because they talk about all the time when they put out what they call heresies, and some of the heresies sound close to the truth. It's hard to say because
You can't say, but yeah. No, it's absolutely right. It would be sad for the book of Revelation to end, victory at the end of Revelation, and then 100 years later, utter destruction. No, that's not what happened. Yes, apostasy happens, and great apostasy, but God's church survives in the hearts, because it's in the hearts of men and women who are Christians. Jeff?
People look on the church as basically an earthly institution or an organization. You can stamp out an organization.
Yeah.
But the church is people who hear the truth and obey it. You can't stamp that out.
No.
You can't eliminate that.
That's good. Let's get verse 14 quickly before we run out of time. My bell rings. Oh, it's in my pocket. Revelation, oops, I didn't go too far. Revelation 11:14. We'll get Bill to read that.
The second woe has passed. Behold, the third woe is soon to come.
Second woe has passed. The third woe is soon to come. Remember, let's quickly get Revelation chapter 8. Revelation chapter 8, I'm going to get these for time's sake. Verse 13. The end of that chapter. Then I looked and heard an eagle crying with a loud voice, and it flew overhead. Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth, at the blast of the other trumpets, that the three trumpets are about to blow. Three woes. Okay? Three woes. Revelation 9 verse 12. The first woe has passed. Behold, two woes are still to come. Well, now at the middle of chapter 11, the second woe has passed. The third woe will come at the sounding of the seventh trumpet. So it has taken us a while to get all the way from chapter 8, which is the sounding of the first trumpet, all the way to the middle of chapter 11 and the sounding of the seventh trumpet. Next week, the Lord willing, we will take up with the sounding of the seventh trumpet and what is going to happen at the end when the seventh trumpet will sound.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of